Welcome to Stop Overthinking, the podcast for overthinkers, people pleasers, and perfectionists who want to feel calm and confident enough to handle whatever life sends your way. I'm your host, Kristen Odegaard, a women's life and mindset coach, lifelong educator, and recovering perfectionist. Welcome back to episode 24 on how to believe new things. This is a really common topic and generally what I do as a life coach and working with people. What I found is that type A people, high achievers, and perfectionists really struggle with this idea. It's like you've heard me say and you understand intellectually that thoughts aren't necessarily true and that it's possible to change our thoughts. We can believe new things. We don't have to believe everything we think. But when high achievers try and do this, they often give up because it's not coming as quickly or as easily as they wanted. Or maybe because there's feelings attached to it that seem really uncomfortable. And ultimately, this is why I do what I do, because you can read and learn a lot about a lot of these ideas, but putting them into practice and having the personalized accountability and support helps you to get past your struggles and into implementing these changes. So it's perhaps why you worked with a personal trainer or a nutritionist in the past, or if you've ever had one-on-one lessons or tutoring to learn a new skill. It's having the accountability and the personalized attention to be able to make it work for you. So the process I'm going to talk about today is one that I do with clients. So how do we get from believing something that isn't helpful to something that we want to believe instead? I often use a technique that's called a thought ladder. And you can imagine a ladder, not a very tall one, with 3 or 4 rungs. I'm not a super creative or imaginative person, but I can handle a ladder, and I'm sure most of you guys can too. So at the bottom of the ladder is what you think and feel right now. The thing you want to change, that you want to think about differently. This can be any topic you want. What I've worked with on clients is thoughts like, I struggle with my weight. I'm trapped in this job. A very common one is it's hard for me to say no when others ask me to do things. For the sake of having a clear example on this podcast, I'm going to work through this last one. It's hard for me to say no when others ask me to do things. So if that's my current thought and I'm feeling resentful, that's my starting point at the bottom of the ladder. At the top is going to be what we want to think and feel. So we often start with a feeling and then kind of work backwards to discover what thought is going to produce that feeling. So think about how you want to feel. Right now it's resentful. Maybe it's confident or peaceful or even content. And then we want to consider what thought is going to bring that feeling. So at the top of the ladder, we do have both, and we do need to figure out both that thought and our feelings because our thoughts influence our feelings. And if you want to feel differently, you have to think about it differently. They go together. So again, for the sake of this example, if at the top of the ladder you want to feel confident, what do you have to think that's going to bring that feeling for you? Okay, and it's going to be a thought, not what you want other people to do, but just a thought that is first person that's going to bring you that feeling. So there are a couple different ways that you can discover what thought might go with that feeling. And one of those is to think back to a time when you did feel confident. Why did you feel confident? So maybe it was when you really nailed a presentation and you got good feedback, or it led to a new account or a new client. So you can consider in that moment, what were you thinking? It might have been something like, I've got this. I am really good at this. I can do it. So you figure out what you were thinking at a past time when you were confident, and you can see if you can use that same thought or a similar thought. Another option would be to use the opposite thought that you have right now. So if our current thought is it's hard to say no to other people, The opposite would be that it's easy to say no when it doesn't suit me. And if I would believe that thought, then I would feel confident. Okay, so the bottom of the ladder is feeling resentful, but chances are that's not the case. It's often not the case because you believe what's at the bottom. So how do you get from what you're thinking and feeling right now to the goal, thought, and feeling? And that's when we use the rungs of this ladder. So the very first baby step is adding the phrase, I notice I keep thinking that it's hard for me to say no. Every time that this thought pops into your head, it's hard to say no, you're going to correct it to say, I notice I keep thinking that it's hard to say no. Attaching this to the beginning of your thought isn't changing the thought or challenging it. What you're doing is just reminding yourself that this is a thought. And this is important because most of the time, our starting point is something that seems so true that we're stuck in this belief that we're just convinced it's a fact. Like it's this divine message and there are no other options. And by using the phrase, I notice I keep thinking, it's adding the context that this is just a sentence in your mind. By adding, I notice I keep thinking in front of the sentence, it puts some perspective on the thought and it goes against the idea that it's just a true fact. So, especially if you have a belief that you know isn't working for you, but you aren't sure that you could ever believe it, something else, or maybe you're not even sure you want to believe something else, just using this phrase can be helpful. Doing this consistently over and over and using this prefix before your thought, over time, the thought feels less intense because your brain starts to recognize it's a thought, it's not a fact. Okay, so that's the first step there is I notice I keep thinking. The next two could be in either order or option, use one or the other. It's an opener or a closer. So an opener is attaching a phrase at the beginning of the thought or attaching a phrase to the end, which is going to be our closer. So in this case, if our goal thought is it's easy to say no to others when necessary, an opener might be I'm practicing believing that it's easy to say no, or I'm open to believing it's easy to say no. One of my personal favorites is I'm learning how to easily say no. Another opener is it's possible that it's easy to say no. The idea is attaching this to the beginning of your goal thought makes it more believable that someday it might happen. Maybe it happens sometimes right now. I'm working up to believing that it's possible to say no. Closer is the same idea, but it comes after the goal thought. So that would sound like it's easy to say no is a thought I'm working to believe. It's easy to say no is possible for me one day. So it's like a qualifier at the end of the thought, so your brain can believe that it might be true or that it's somewhat true and it's not outright rejected. Just makes it easier to believe. Another example, I have said no without guilt before. Or perhaps people have understood that I have other things on my plate. They're not necessarily positive or negative. It's like a step along the way in the middle of your positive and your negative thought. It has nothing to do with saying no or not feeling guilty or any of those, but is still getting somewhere in the middle. I have done a lot of this thought work with body image, and I used the thought ladder for that as well. And one that I started with was my stomach is gross. I hated looking in the mirror and looking at it. To me, it was just gross. There was no way for me to jump to that, it's beautiful or even that it was good enough. Like I wasn't ready for that. And it wasn't going to work. So I needed some steps in between to be able to get there. My neutral thought in this case was things like, I have a human stomach, I have a human body, my body has carried 2 babies. Things that are factual, not attached to feeling. Okay. It wasn't that it was gross or that it was beautiful. It was just something that was neutral in between. And this is where I think positive thinking and affirmations often go wrong for people. For many of you listening to this, your thoughts are deeply ingrained. And if you could just make it positive, you probably already would have. But it's not working because you don't believe it. And subconsciously, your mind and body knows that. It's like going from 0 to 100 with no stops in between. Now, some people maybe have done some of this type of work before, or maybe they're so incredibly disciplined that they can just keep repeating this new thought until they do believe it. And that will likely take weeks or maybe even months. And the reality is, most of us just aren't that committed because we're going to think this positive thought. It's not going to be believable, or our brain is going to give us all sorts of resistance and reasons why it's not true. And then we're just like, oh, this doesn't work. And we give up. So a neutral thought is really the key. It's not all the way to the positive thought. It's somewhere in between. And if the general thought, like we've been using this whole podcast, it's hard to say no, and I don't like disappointing people, then you don't go straight to it's easy to say no without doubt or guilt. You don't believe that. And you're just going to have this resistance and anxiety and judgment to yourself if you try to force it too soon. So thought work here is really kind of like an art. It's not a science. There's not one formula or one phrase that's going to work for everything for everyone. And that's why it can be really helpful to work with me or another coach, because we can find that, formula for you in this moment. Okay, but it's completely possible that you can do this on your own as well. So if you have a negative thought, you're just going to brainstorm a few neutral thoughts until you find one or two that really fit for you. You can think of it like trying on shoes. You know your size and that there's tons of options, but there's going to be some that are just more comfortable or more practical for whatever you're doing. Okay, so you brainstorm, come up with a bunch, see, you might use one and be like, nah, that's really not working for me. And 2 days later, find something else. You could also consider, what would you tell a friend that had this negative thought? Can you believe that? Importantly, though, whatever thought you use for your latter thinking, is that it's something that you believe. This part is intuitive, whether you can believe it or not. Because your latter thought must be believable or it's not going to work. However, believable doesn't mean that you're automatically going to feel amazing and not have any more negative thoughts. It just means when you think that sentence, only that sentence, that it's believable. There isn't going to be one sentence that is so powerful and you think it once, you're going to fully embrace it and never have any contrary thoughts again. Okay, so just that one sentence with a period on the end, and that is believable. Does it feel a little bit better than the current thought? Okay, it's not, you don't have to think that it's going to prevent you from having any other negative thoughts, just that it helps you feel a little bit better. And then the idea, you come up with these, you actually have to practice it. Once you have a thought, you must intentionally think this consistently, daily, not just when it pops up into your head. Some advice that I give to clients and people working on this is you can set a phone alarm for a couple times a day. I love sticky notes. You can put it on your bathroom mirror or near the kitchen sink or on your computer. If you don't want others to see what it says, then just use a word or a phrase or an acronym as a reminder, and they won't know the difference. When I have been actively working on new thoughts, I would record a voice memo of myself saying it, and then I would play it on repeat in the car. So whatever you can do to bring this conscious, intentional thought forward, it will take some time because you're retraining your brain. You're building new neural pathways. You're likely breaking down years of believing and conditioning of this one thing. So it's not going to take years, but it's likely going to take a few weeks. And like anything else, it takes practice. And if your brain reacts like a toddler and throws a tantrum, you're not doing anything wrong. You just redirect, repeat, and it takes time. So you'll practice your new thought and your brain's going to go, oh, here's all these reasons why this can't be true and you're not going to do it and you're a failure and all, and you don't need to argue with it. You don't need to judge yourself. You don't need to think that you're doing it wrong. You just keep repeating your thought. This is why it has to be that believable thought. And you just keep repeating it. You keep it concrete, specific, and repeat. So you can use this ladder technique to believe new things about yourself, about situations, or even other people. It's a great tool to use to move out of negativity slowly, but something that's actually sustainable and is going to work long term. So give it a try with the thought that you are ready to change. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you later. Thank you for listening to the Stop Overthinking podcast with Kristen Odegaard. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone else who would benefit from the message. To learn more about working with me and links to social media and free resources, head over to my website, coachwithkristen.com. That's Kristen spelled Kristen. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. Have a great week.